Hello and welcome to the week 6 assignment demo for the beginner drawing course. And in this assignment demo, we're basically just going to be doing some cubes and cylinders. And at the last part of it, we're going to be doing some more complex forms within those more simplistic forms. So we're going to be using 1 and 2 point perspective grids because this is a beginner course, and the more advanced stuff is 3 point, 4 point perspective, which we will get into later once the beginner drawing course editions grow into the maybe 20-week edition. We'll start rocking it. But for now, this will be enough to get our feet wet in terms of perspective. So let's just start with that beautiful, gorgeous horizon line, after which we will then establish the vanishing point just off to the side here somewhere, if we can get a brush that is reasonable for drawing. So there's our VP, our vanishing point. And remember, this is the horizon line. So the vanishing point is where all the geometry is going to ultimately converge as far as the vertices and edges go. And the horizon line is what will dictate whether we are seeing the top or bottom plane of the geometry. So if that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it right now, because it will as we begin to draw some things. Now, I'm not going to be a huge stickler about how you draw your shapes as long as they are in a reasonably accurate perspective. So that means that if we want to go ahead and extrapolate with the line tool, we can totally do that. It's not about drawing straight lines and practicing straight lines if you really don't have the inkling to do that in terms of your draftsmanship or draftswomanship, whatever you want to call it. You can totally just use the line tool to get these things done. So what I've done so far is I've just established some diagonal lines that converge at the vanishing point, because I know that from the diagonal lines I can then find intersecting points using horizontal and vertical lines. So if you are a little confused as to these lines, I don't know how you made it to this lesson, you should probably go back to lesson 1 and ensure that you understand these lines well enough to start doing some perspective-based exercises like we are doing here. What I've just done is taken another vertical, maybe I'm not the one who understands the lines. So what I've just done here, as joking aside, is I've taken this diagonal line from this little point here and moved it through these 2 horizontal lines back to the vanishing point, where it has again converged with the rest of the lines that we're establishing. I'm now going to do another 90-degree vertical line and a 0-degree horizontal line. So last but not least, we're going to take another couple lines back to the VP here, and then another horizontal, and then this point of intersection here gives me another vertical, which ends up right there. So all of this aside, we now have our basic cube geometry in 1 point perspective using vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines. So I can get rid of some of the excess for now, just so that you can see the geometry without all the convergence and all the guessing, or all the checking. It's like we just need the answer. We don't need to show the work of the math problem. We just want to know the answer. So what I'm doing right now is I'm getting rid of all those elements that don't just show the rectangular prism that I want to show. So this is the rectangular prism, and I am purposely showing both the bottom and the top planes. All of these lines converge at the vanishing point, and they are established based on this horizon line. And it just makes a lot of sense logically to change the color so that we can get a good idea here of, I'm going to copy this and then bring the lines back. So so we can get a good idea of how these things fit together cohesively. So here we have the green lines being how we worked out our perspective, and I did it in a not the most efficient way, but I just took the lines back to the vanishing point to make sure that I had this particular geometry at the very end. But let me show you again another way that we can do this that's much more efficient. You can start from any vertical or any horizontal really and bring its endpoints back to the vanishing point. So that's what we'll do here. I'm going to start with, let's say, red. Now just making random horizontal line. So now we have these 2 points, which we're going to bring back to the vanishing point. Boom. And red is actually not a great color because my vanishing point is red, so let me just make this purple quick. And boom. So now that line should have showed up. Oh, we have our alpha locked because I did the fill. So yes, this is our horizontal line using 2 diagonal lines taken back to the vanishing point based on these endpoints right here. But now we can drop in any sort of vertical line as we did in the demo. I'm not going to bring them all the way down. I'll keep them above the horizon line. So any sort of vertical lines now, which we can then connect with another horizontal line. So that's only 3 lines. And we'll then take those back to the vanishing point as well. So these points of convergence between the newly created horizontal and vertical lines. And now we have another rectangular prism projected from the vanishing point, or projected back to the vanishing point, depending on how you look at it, in space. So we can cut this off anywhere using more verticals and horizontals. I'll do that with green. So let's say it's pretty long, it extends pretty far back to the vanishing point. I'll bring it down horizontally, or to that diagonal line, and then I'll horizontally connect to that diagonal line, bring it back upward, make sure I hit the right diagonal line here, not the bottom one. I actually went a little too far and I hit the wrong line there, so let's reset. See, it's like a math problem where the steps have to be pretty proper. So this bottom line, I have to bring it to that first, then bring it to this line, bring it up to this line right here, which is that corner, and then again horizontally. So basically just drawing a square on the canvas, and there we have it. We now have, changed the endpoint, if you will, of this particular piece of geometry. If we get rid of all this stuff, it's easier to see it. So this line would continue through. We would be seeing it add up to this point. But that is, again, another piece of geometry that we've created using our vanishing point here. It's just a mixture of vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines. You can start with any square, anywhere, and this isn't a square, it's a rectangle, but any rectangle anywhere, and then take all of its points back and then just kind of chop it off. So this time we'll do it again because repetition is magical. It teaches us something new every single time because we're approaching it in slightly different ways. In this case, I'm not going to draw all the way through the forms because that can be a little visually confusing. I'm just going to lop those off here. And now we have this wonderful shape. So I'm going to do this a ton more, and you're going to watch, and you're going to then copy the various methods. It doesn't have to be the exact same shape, but copy the various methods so that you too can understand how to create shapes in perspective, because that is my goal for you. I want you to be able to understand this. It seems really boring now, and I don't begrudge you that. However, the more you understand about this process, the more freedom you will have on this picture plane. So in this case, we're not going to be seeing the top plane here unless I completely draw through the form, because it is above the horizon line. We'd be seeing the bottom of it, or we wouldn't be seeing the top plane of a given form. I keep using red even though the vanishing point is red. We would only see the top of that form if we were below the horizon line. So this is the top plane right here. And then we can use those vertical lines again, the horizontal lines as well, and then just get rid of that action that we don't need on both of these. Get rid of the extra math. Let's just take the horizontal line here, shoot through the vanishing point in perspective, and shoot back there. So this actually would end up more like right here based on these intersections. But at any rate, this is, again, visually confusing. I'm only drawing through it so that you can get an idea of the 3D geometry, but I would prefer just to keep them opaque. So just drop in another rectangle, and we're not going to draw through the forms. I'm going to do 15 of these guys, so we'll just time lapse through this and then talk about it for a little bit afterwards. And Alright, so post time lapse, you can see that only the planes or faces that are in alignment with the vanishing point are visible. The ones that are facing the viewer, so the ones that are nearest to us, as well as the ones that converge. However, sometimes it's nice to draw the unseen side just to get a real feel of the dimensionality. Now we're going to go into drawing a couple cylinders inside some of these rectangles. So let's start with this one. Let's do this one right here since it's kind of set up well for that. So in terms of measurement, what we can do is take each corner, just like so, to find the center. And then once we know where the center is, which we can do on any surface plane, really. So I'll do it on the layer behind so we don't interrupt our views of what is in front of what. So this is the center right here of any given surface plane that we subdivide diagonally. Again, like so. This again is the center. So knowing that we find the center, that means that we can draw lines through it, even if they're imperfect. So these subdivisions right here make it easier to configure where our cylinder can be placed within our rectangle. So one way to take care of that is to mark off the 4 kind of north, south, west, and east points. And then instead of subdividing it diagonally, you pretty much want to take and use a curved line from point to point. And since we're, of course, rectangular, the cylinder is going to have a rectangular sort of distortion. It's not going to be a regular cylinder, meaning that it's a perfect circle extruded. So let's just do that real quick. From here to here, and again here. And we'll just do the same thing on the other side, like so. Again, not completely perfect, but it's just about getting the perspective accurate, which is what we're doing by subdividing these forms. Next, we can go toward the vanishing point with these points now, because we now have points we can work from. And that means that we're going to pretty much just mirror what we did here on this back plane. So I'll take those away for the time being. We will now subdivide this. Let's do it in green. So now we have our center again, which means that this and this are now connected in perspective. I'll do that on a layer below and in a different color, so we can again have some visual distinction here. And that means that we now have a nice line that would line up directly with the vanishing point if we want to make sure it hits both of them. You can just extrude back like that. So now we have the pretty much perfect zero, or close to the perfect zero, of this particular piece of geometry that we're subdividing here. A lot of this is just like 3D modeling. If you can wrap your head around that, you'll have a very augmented and easy time doing it in 2D. So again, since we found the center, we know we can work our way through it again, and then just kind of follow suit with what we did on the surface plane that is closest to our view. And then we just basically end up connecting these up to one another, as we do in similar ways with the square. So we pretty much can just take these edges and line them up. I connect this point to this point, and we're starting to modify our geometry that was rectangular and then slowly making it cylindrical. Now, this can also be done obviously vertically if we have a more tall piece of geometry as opposed to something that's sort of longer as it lays toward the vanishing point. So we can do that with something like this. Just subdivide the bottom here and find what is approximately the center, after which we can take the vanishing point and extrude outward through the center, and then use a horizontal line. We can line it up properly here to once again give us enough of a guide to draw through these other points. 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to do that one over just to get a little more uniformity there. So then we could take this point, bring it all the way upward, take this point, and basically we're going to need to define the other plane here. So I'll do that quickly, because otherwise we won't be able to see the three-dimensionality of the forms, which means that we won't be able to get it as accurate. So that's a little bit better there. I'll get rid of these just to drop a touch of the visual confusion out of the way. But this is a great brain exercise. Even if your shapes are a bit distorted and irregular, you'll get better the more that you do them, which is why I recommend doing several sheets of these. So it can't just connect to the center very accurately. We have to follow suit with some of these other points that we've used. So make sure we're on a good layer for that here, and then we'll go through our process once more just to make sure that everything is going back to that vanishing point. That's always the key, is to ensure that our vanishing point is always helping things converge in a way that makes sense. And as you can see, there's an interesting distortion between this bottom plane and this top plane, and that's just the perspective that we've created for ourselves using this particular modality of perspective. Now that we know that that center line goes through, we could take it all the way through the top here, like that. And then we have our subdivisions once again, so we'll switch our color back. Mark off the points on each, and then start to approximate our cylinder through those points. There we go. After which we can connect these up. And now we have the cylindrical equivalent that we've built inside of the box, which again looks visually fairly difficult to kind of parse with all the additional lines there. So if I go ahead and remove some of those, it's a little easier to see, and then we can drop some of the opacity on these that are not as close to the viewer by taking away some of the contrast, which is a different principle, the principle of value. So I'll just go ahead and lighten these a little bit quickly. And now it's much easier to see the three-dimensionality of the forms as they kind of come together. I'm not too worried about the distortions at this point, just because, again, this is a beginner drawing course. We're just trying to get the process of these things down and to understand the dimensionality that's going on here. Of course, we do want to iron them out as we move forward, but again, as long as you know the process and the thinking and the fundamentals kind of behind it, the technique will come. So let's just talk about two-point perspective for the demo, and then I will draw a more unique and interesting, more complex form within either a cylinder or a cube in 1 or 2 point perspective, and then we'll call this one good. So let's hop to the next section. Okay, as promised, we're going to rock some 2 point perspective. One of the key distinctions between 1 and 2 point perspective is 2 vanishing points, of course. And that means that when we create our horizontal and vertical lines, they're going to have to align with both of these vanishing points as opposed to just one. So let me just demonstrate that. First, we'll start with our vertical line. Then we will take the 2 points of that line, the 2 endpoints, bring it back. And if it were 1 point, that's all we would do. But since it's 2 point, we got to do twice the work. Isn't that what you love? More work? So let's stop there for a second. We've now taken our vertical line back to both points. So 2 edges out of each point converging back to the vanishing point. What I'm going to do now is jump up in value and lowering the saturation, which will create a lighter line. We can do a little lighter than that to give ourselves the see-through aspects of the shape. So now that I've gone and done that, what I can do is mark that off so I can return to that color and value later, because what I'm going to do first is I'm going to cut off the edges of this particular shape with 2 more vertical lines. So now we're going to take that particular value and color and start taking these back to the vanishing points as well. So let's just do that quick. Go 1, 2, and 1, 2. And finally, since we have a point of convergence, we now know that that's where that side would end. So we've now created a cube in 2 point perspective. Let's just get rid of these quickly. Then we'll get rid of some of these as well, because we really don't need more visual confusion at this point. But let's just showcase the most important sides of our cube, which are these ones. I mean, except for obviously the foreground perspective edges. So we'll drop those out quick. And now we have a cube in 2-point perspective, which is also in kind of X-ray mode here, our see-through mode that helps us understand the unseen side of our geometry. So much like in 1-point perspective, we can still subdivide our geometry in ways that are favorable for finding the center of particular planes, just like this right here. Mark that off quick. You can follow suit up with the top surface plane here, which we can only see because it's an X-ray. If we weren't, in X-ray mode here, we would just see these faces because it's above the vanishing point. It's above the horizon line, excuse me. So now we have these 2 points of convergence, which we can then use our vertical line and take that vertical line back to the vanishing point. Those 2 other points, and we'll just follow suit one more time. And what that gives us is the ability to find and extrapolate the halfway point of the entire piece of geometry. Because I can take that and make sure it goes all the way through both of those points to match up right here, and then stop at the top right there. And then I can do the same with this, through this, all the way back. So kind of like that. And we'll just get rid of some of the excess to make it apparent what we just did, which is finding the center of subdivision. So pull this, pull that. Gotta get rid of this now. All right, so what we did is we just sliced this in half, essentially. And we could do the same thing on the other side if we want to, just for fun and demonstration here. Got to go all the way through these points to right here. That means we stop right up at the top again and go through the top point, looping it back to our vanishing point. So once again, the points of convergence where they're touching, that's how we know we've lined it up properly. And now we've cut it again, and you can see that we've not only found the center of those planes, but we've used it to subdivide and create other surface planes within this larger bit of geometry. This is immensely helpful for architecture and for product design and for many other facets and elements of drawing that are outside the scope of this course. But just knowing this fundamental technique of how to bring all these points back to the proper elements of the vanishing point is completely and utterly invaluable for a lot of hard surface type drawing, whether again it's in architecture, product design, mechanical design, etc. So now that we've kind of already broken up this cube in ways that make it easy, we will draw our cylinder within it in 2-point perspective. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mark off this point and this point, this point, and this point. And you already know where we're going with this. If you've been watching thus far, you know we're going to want to arc around using our curved lines now. So that's what I'm going to do. I got pretty close to hitting that line. We're just going to cheat it a little bit. Just pull that baby right into there. No one needs to know. It can be our little secret. We'll do it again. And then one more time. And this is probably going to be the hardest one. Yep, I was right. It's because I'm left-handed, and so moving my hand this way in an arc is not very easy. But if I flip the canvas, which should only take a second here, then I can Try it again. Almost, close enough. So you can just go ahead and fix that a little bit. This is why a lot of the time we can utilize tools like 3D modeling to get our geometry and perspective right, because trigonometry does a lot of that work for us, and this is just one modality of creating these shapes. It's kind of the old school way of doing it, but it has its drawbacks, of course. But if you're working on your drafting, it's very helpful. But you may need to do some adjustment, as you've seen me kind of do there. Next, of course, these lines automatically match up. What I could conceivably do is just draw upward for these points. Right about here, and then here, and then kind of follow suit with the top plane here. You see, this is quite challenging, and that's okay. We're stretching our abilities here. Almost lined it up. There we go. Sweet. Okay. So I'm just flipping the canvas to check, and the distortion isn't horrific. So that is basically another way to construct a cylinder within a 2-point perspective cube. Again, we would not be seeing these sides right here if we weren't doing it in X-ray mode, which is useful, of course, for understanding all the shapes involved in your design process. But if you're just drawing and trying to create something that looks good or looks more like a finished drawing, we would only be drawing what people could see. And that means that we'd only need to get this front portion kind of done. But I'm, again, showing it, doing these technical exercises, and putting myself through these different and interesting and difficult challenges so that I can show you different ways of approaching the problem. So there's our cylinder within our 2-point perspective cube. What I'm going to do now is just do a couple more 2-point perspective cubes from above and below the horizon line, and then I'm going to reset the canvas and draw something within 2-point perspective and just get things aligned in a way that demonstrates the final part of the lesson. So we'll start up here, just like so. Remember, bring it back and forth. I'm not going to draw all the way through this one. So there's our vertical. Bring it back this way. There's our other vertical. And bring it back that way. And now we have our geometry. We need not go all the way through to the unseen side in certain cases. It's good to practice both, however, which is why we show it in the assignment demo. And that is above the horizon line in 2-point perspective. We can only see these 3 planes. Now I'm going to do the same thing below the horizon line, and let's make kind of a tall one. That'll be fun. And bring it home, bring it back. You know the drill. 2 points. Find the cutoff points that you want to use. So I'll do one vertical line here, one vertical line right here. And then we'll just pitch those back at the appropriate angles. And we'll get rid of the excess. And now you can see we have our geometry. And all these geometry, all of this geometry, excuse me, is corresponding. These, much like, let me just put all these in a group quick. Much like these, all have a singular vanishing point that they are harmonizing with, meaning that you have a better chance of aligning things and making sure that the perspective is correct. Again, this is very important for doing things like interiors, vehicles, buildings, all based on angles, all based on a little bit of logic and math. So it's really useful if you're trying to do some of those elements. But again, I just want you to be familiar with it in sort of its rawest form for the beginner course. As I work my way through a couple more perspective books in the future, I will be distilling down this knowledge once again and improving not only probably this course, but having courses that are a little more catered to that specialty. So this is sort of a general course. Anyway, that pretty much concludes the second half of the demo. Let's create one more aspect of the demo. My math was wrong there, 1, 2, we have one full thing. So let's go 1.5 and create a more interesting drawing within some of these perspective guidelines. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this group, and I'm going to get rid of pretty much all of it until I find where my horizon line and vanishing points are. After which we will create a cube that I can draw a different and interesting form within than a cylinder. So let's start it off close to the middle, and I think I'm going to go I'm actually going to move my vanishing point up. Let's move the VP up a little bit here. So just go a little higher with that, so we can really see the bottom plane of whatever we're going to be creating. And make sure we're not on any layer we don't want to be. Start with our vertical line nearly in the center. Do our process over again, which it's good to watch. It's good to see the repetition. Let's cut it off pretty narrow. I don't want to go and extend really far out into this picture plane. I'm going to do something that's more object-based than something that has more of like a recession back to those vanishing points. I am going to do the unseen side as well, just because it's really going to help with the drawing. And I'm also going to use the polygonal lasso tool because that's just better for these more measured cuts that I've been doing here. So knock that out. Knock these out as well. And then I'm going to go on a layer below, raise up the brightness, so we're going to blend in with the background a little more, and then I'll start taking these back, just so I can have a clearer idea of the geometry that I am working with. And that's pretty much that. So get these out of the way. Get these out of the way. And now we have our 2-point perspective cube that we can now draw something within. Okay, so a slightly more complex form that I can think of at this point would be, say, a potted plant. So let's just do what we've done before and find our center quick. After which we can do the same thing up top, and I'm going to change the color just so we have less visual confusion. And now I'm just going to take this and bring it above, so we have a different mark to hit. And then we'll start with another line in the center. And we're off to a pretty decent start. Let's draw using that as a guide. Just bundle all that up in a nice little group. So I know that the bottom of my cylinder can start somewhere around here. Then I can work upwards with this top plane. Just doing much more vague approximations because it's a very sketchy process. It's a little less rigid than the other perspective exercises. And I'll start to kind of adjust, because that's not as correct back there. But this at the forefront is closer. We can just skew it a little bit within the boundaries of our pre-established geometry. Get rid of the stuff retreating back. There we go. So we're having that sort of tapered cylinder. And then we could conceivably draw another cube up here or something, but I'm just going to kind of riff with some leaf shapes. Just drawing a lot of curved lines that are going to meet up based on where a stem would be. And eventually we will start to polish the drawing a little bit, but for now I just want to lay these shapes in. Some of them breaching the top of the pot, of course, because nature cannot always be contained. In fact, most of the time it kind of cannot, especially if you don't watch it, trim it up and whatnot. So let's get a little more on that side. And we're going to be seeing the bottom plane of these leaves because of our viewpoint. They are going above the horizon line, whereas these are below it. So we'll be seeing the top of these leaves. This is what perspective is very useful for. So now we sort of have the roughed in elements of this houseplant and flower pot. A nice little sketch based on the geometry that we have established. And I could knock that back a little bit as well, and then just start drawing a touch cleaner so that we can have a little bit of a nicer drawing for the end of the demo. So just take these. Just connect these back up to where a stem would be. In case you haven't really noted, I'm sure those of you who have been paying more attention will start to realize that you can use any point as a point of extrusion. Any point as a point of projection, rather. So these ideas about drawing and fabricating geometry based on points and lines, a lot of it comes back to thinking about projections coming out of that single point. And any piece of geometry can have something sort of coming out of it. So I'm doing now with these leaves. So I'm just creating a lot of stacked shapes that are kind of emitting from a stem that I'm imagining in the center. And the leaves are not going to be in perfect perspective because we'd have to draw so many cubes and then fit the leaves inside those cubes. But this general guideline, especially if we're flipping the canvas and checking for errors, makes it very nice to relate these points to one another. Thinking of things in terms of points and lines and extrusions and projections, and having relationships as far as what points, such as vanishing points, they're returning to, is just an immensely helpful element of drawing. It is one of the most foundational things that you should take away from this lesson. Even if you don't plan on using a ton of more scholarly or academic or rigid perspective, which is sort of a specialty nowadays, depending on what field or what area of drawing you want to get into, because much of it is kind of done by CAD drafting nowadays. Some of these programs that are much more 3D based, of course. So this aspect of drawing is pretty specialized in a lot of the industry. For example, if you wanted to get a job as a concept artist who does a lot of machines, and you really, for some reason, didn't want to use 3D, perspective would be really good to know, because that way you can make sure that a lot of your design elements are aligned. And those are going to be integral for whatever machine you're trying to build. Back in the day, they had no choice but to design all sorts of objects and machines with this perspective in a much more advanced capacity. 3-point perspective, relating things to 3 different points and having so many lines on the canvas that your mind would bend. But that is kind of antiquated nowadays. This is 2020 when this video is being recorded. And again, a lot of it's CAD software. And so this type of perspective comes in handy for designers such as Scott Robertson, who I'm planning on buying his book soon to learn a little more about it, just because I like to learn in general, even if it's not the most practical thing one could do. I just like it for the skill building, for the mental exercise. It's like, even if somebody doesn't compete in bodybuilding competitions, it doesn't mean they don't enjoy working out. It doesn't always have to have a practical, 100% practical sort of thing. It can still enrich your existence. The main things, again, to take away are how to relate your geometry or whatever shape you're creating to the horizon line, to the vanishing points therein, to make sure that we're seeing the bottom of what we should be seeing the bottom of, the top of what we should be seeing the top of, and subdividing your guides and forms and geometries in a way that bodes well for the viewer and doesn't have a great deal of distortion that starts to muddy the message. If you can't tell what it is, or if things are just so horribly distorted that it gets in the way of enjoying it, that's when we start to have issues. Of course, week 9 in the beginner drawing course is all about ameliorating those issues, amending the things that are holding the drawing back. So that's always something that you can look forward to for those of you who purchase the 12-week or the 13-week editions. Just gonna flip the canvas quick. We're getting pretty close to enough detail for this thing. One thing I'm doing a lot here is squinting, so I can see what the drawing is kind of doing, because I'm adding more and more layers here. And I have to keep track of what's in front of what, where these occlusions and shadows can kind of come into play and fall. In lesson 3, when we're learning to draw and see from life, you can totally choose a house plan. It's something that pretty much everybody has somewhere, even if it's a fake one, and try to parse the complexity. Just because you've done an assignment once doesn't mean that you've gotten everything from it. Pretty considerable shadow underneath this one. I feel like I should start hinting at the stem more in the center, so we'll add a little more focal lines there. I'm just sort of carving away at these, using only line and occlusions and a lot of curved shapes. We can have some of the prettiest points coming out of the top. Nice little flower-like flourishes there. But really, it's just helpful to check with the perspective. And that's just one kind of made-up plant. You can start to detail the leaves, of course. Adding whatever you like to these shapes. One thing about subdividing geometry is you understand drawing on the forms better as well. All the practice lines back up into expression. So even if something is just a technical exercise and doesn't turn out the prettiest, you're still learning. You're still getting fundamental potency that you can bring into other areas. So I'm going to probably leave this alone. Get rid of this one, bring this back to fuller opacity. And then I'm going to just add very simple value separations really quick here, just so we can see what we've done a little bit better. So this first one, we'll make sort of a mid-ranged tone for the pot. Make the plant a little bit darker than that. So I'm going to use freeform because it's a little bit more of a freeform shape. Just start to outline, trace some of these leaves so that we can distinguish it from the background, of which we now only have lines to do so. We want a little bit of value here as well for the demo drawing. Even if it's very quick, doesn't have to be perfect. Just one way of consolidating the shape, and now we can much better see what we're doing. Sometimes it's very hard to work solely in line, which is why I have lessons on value as well, and having larger sized brushes or tips for mark making. Drawing and painting tend to blur into one another after a while, so we'll eventually get there the more I extend the course. But that is pretty much it. We used 2-point perspective to drop in this pretty little plant sketch. And of course, you could always make it a little clearer by getting rid of the lines that have no bearing in terms of overlap, keeping only the ones that really do and serve the overall form. But yeah, you don't have to do everything perfectly or bring everything back to the vanishing point once your base geometry is there. This isn't perfectly in alignment with the 2-point perspective cube that I created, but it still helped me to devise this drawing and to have reasonably accurate perspective. But the more objects I would add to the scene, the more I would have to make sure that the perspective is really on point for each object, just so we don't get those sort of visual distortions that are occurring between different objects if they're not all in the same perspective. So I just want to say thank you for watching. Be sure to do lots and lots of these exercises as well as these exercises, because it'll make stuff like this way easier and way more understandable. It's just a process of, remembering how all the little lines converge back to the vanishing point, what surface planes you're seeing based on the geometry and the vanishing points on the horizon line, and how to subdivide them. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Happy drawing.